Hey, it's High on Life 2, a game with lots of talking guns and large, crazy arenas, skateboards, and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I'm John Linneman. We're here to talk about this game today. This is the newest game from Squanch Games, running Unreal Engine 5. And Oliver, you've been playing on console. I've been playing on PC. There's a lot to talk about, right?
Yeah, I do like myself some talking guns, I suppose. And this is a fun game, definitely an interesting game in some ways that I did not quite expect.
Yes, indeed. And this is one of those games where the guns seem to have more emotional baggage than the player himself. So, yeah, there's a lot to talk about today. But before we get into it, a quick word from our sponsor.
With over 38 million users worldwide, CyberGhost VPN is one of the most trusted VPN providers on the market. Fundamentally, a VPN is essential for protecting your digital privacy. Even if you think you have the bases covered by browsing in incognito mode, think again. Plenty of eyes are still watching anytime you go online, whether it's your internet service provider, school or work IT department, or the websites themselves. Your activity is still being tracked. And that's where CyberGhost VPN comes in. CyberGhost adds an essential layer of protection by encrypting and rerouting your connection through its secure servers. Just turn CyberGhost VPN on before you browse. Select from any one of over 100 locations, and from that point, no one will know about your online activity. It works on all operating systems, plus it can protect 7 of your devices at the same time, so it's perfect for sharing with friends and family. As an extra bonus, by changing your location with CyberGhost, you can even access geo-restricted video content on over 40 video streaming platforms. So check out the description below for CyberGhost's best deal at a sizable 84% discount with 4 months for free. You'll get 24/7 customer service support. Plus, for peace of mind, there's a 45-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it for yourself and judge it for yourself. And now, back to the video.
That was indeed a quick word, but now we're here to talk about High on Life 2. Oliver, you and I have both been playing this game. I've been playing on PC, as I noted. You're on the consoles. I really like this game so far. Before we get into the tech, I just want to talk a little bit about the game itself. And I like your comparison here. In the notes, you wrote that there's influences from Halo, the new Doom games. There's a little bit of Sunset Overdrive, maybe some BioShock Infinite. And when you actually put all those things together, I see exactly where you're coming from. It's got this like sort of high-flying, acrobatic sort of feel to it. That I really, really enjoy. The skateboard is an awesome addition. I didn't think it would work in first person, but it absolutely does. It's a lot of fun. You're moving quick, grinding rails, jumping from rail to rail, hitting half pipes while dealing with enemies. It actually genuinely works well. The gunplay is indeed more Halo-like, where you're getting in close, you're dealing with foes both at close and far range. It definitely has that kinetic feel to it. This is not a Call of Duty style shooter, which I very much like.
It's interesting you mentioned all those influences because I certainly felt them while I was playing. But I think the key here is that even though that kind of sounds like a bit of a bit of a mouthful, something to wrap your head around that's a little bit challenging, it actually plays very smoothly because like when you use the skateboard, which you activate just by pressing the left stick, so it's kind of like an alternative sprint there. You kind of snap to rails instantly, and it has a really strong magnetism to it, so you snap to them from fairly far away. And it's very easy to just go around the environment, hit rails, hit things without really thinking about it too much, and be able to actually engage in these big combat sequences in these wide open gameplay arenas without actually like needing to navigate it. It's not quite as technical as something like Titanfall, for instance, which requires a bit more maneuvering, or certainly something like Mirror's Edge, which is obviously much more built around its traversal mechanics. In this case, it's kind of incidental to the experience. And I did really feel like those new Doom influences, those Halo influences, all throughout. I think it's a very flexible and fast shooting game, and it's actually surprisingly fun. The first game was quite good in that respect as well, but I think this is just dialed up in terms of polish. Just like the first game, it's also broken up a little bit by puzzles. So you have these short little puzzles in kind of a Metroidvania style in some cases, where you gain new abilities, you can unlock previously explored areas, things like that. You also get these just short little puzzles using these blob-like characters that you manipulate in different ways. That's perhaps a little bit of a break from the action, but of course this game is kind of defined by its humor, as was the first game. I found it kind of amusing, which is also how I found the first game, but I found the humor a little bit more assessed here. Doesn't try to get in your face quite as much, I would say. And there are also some
Yeah.
recognizable voice actors in here, at least to me, like Richard Kind, Ken Marino, and Ralph Ineson, who played Sid in Final Fantasy XVI. People remember him from that role. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure how I feel about the humor overall, but at least as a narrative device and as a mechanism for pushing the story forward, I actually think it works well, and perhaps it works better than some other like plots in other games that are a little bit more cerebral and involve political machinations and things like this. This is a little bit simpler and easier to relate to, perhaps.
I mean, obviously, it wears its Rick and Morty influences on its sleeves. I mean, that's the whole point of Squanch games in a way. But as you kind of noted, I do feel it's slightly more subdued than the original in a way that I found tasteful. The humor's fun if you're into that. I actually thought it was pretty entertaining. I enjoyed it, but it's not quite as grating at times, shall we say. So I think it's a success on that front. And just the overall presentation, the feel of everything, the way they run through it. We can't talk about everything in here, but there's some amazing stuff with switching between scenes very quickly that happens in the game at certain points. And it's impressive that it all works so well on this engine. So, and speaking of engine, as I noted earlier, High End Life 2 is indeed Unreal Engine 5, but of course, we've seen a lot of Unreal Engine 5 games at this point and kind of know what to expect. But even still, Oliver, why don't you lay out sort of the details in terms of which UE5 features are leveraged in this game?
Yeah, so High on Life 2 is a very conventional UE5 game, in a good way, in this case, in the sense that it's using all the kind of key systems. So we're seeing like Lumen, Nanite, and VSM here, all the key kind of UE5 signature systems. So that means really high quality diffuse indirect lighting with lots of interesting color contribution and satisfying occlusion. Glossy surfaces are reflective and provide a decent reflection of the environment, even when that detail is occluded from screen space. Pop-in is quite minimal because the world geometry doesn't use discrete LODs, it's relying on nanite. There is some visible pop-in here and there from other elements, but it's not too bad. And shadows are accurate looking and don't have obvious cascade lines because they're using VSM. But this isn't kind of like a UE5 best practices exemplar necessarily, because they're doing some things that are a bit unusual. So the first thing is they're using a lot of very mirror-like reflective surfaces with not very many imperfections. So that's fine, and in other games that wouldn't necessarily be a cause for concern. But here, because they are using software Lumen, you get that really low-quality SDF-based Lumen scene representation in full view, which is like totally largely static. It has all these blobby outlines on things that doesn't look very good at it, right?
I would say, Oliver, it's like the thing is, some of these areas reminded me of Ratchet and Clank for PS5,
yeah,
where they do a lot of similar things. But in that case, the way they handled reflections in that game produced much cleaner results. Similar to the Spider-Man games, where here, using software Lumen with the SDFs, it sort of just reveals the flaw in it. And that's unfortunate. And we'll talk about the PC version later, but unfortunately, it does not support hardware Lumen,
right.
which means you are stuck with the SDF representation as opposed to the full polygon tracing, which would have looked a lot better.
Yeah, with a game like Ratchet and Clank, you get a pretty high quality representation of the scene with like relatively accurate lighting and importantly skinned meshes, so you see the characters going around and whatnot. And here it's just like totally not that. It's better than a cube map, but it's not really
for sure
something that holds up to like super close inspection there. Secondly, and this is a little bit more befuddling for me, is they use screen space contact shadows very extensively. Now, these are great choices, I think, in a lot of games. I really like their screen space shadows because they use them for a lot of small scale details that wouldn't normally fit well into a normal shadow map, or in the case of VSM would be like pretty expensive, right? Like rivets or rocks or blades of grass, things like that. Where if you're seeing the shadow, you're probably almost certainly seeing the casting object as well, because there's not much space and screen space between those two things. So screen space inaccuracies aren't a problem. But here, they're kind of using them all over the place, even for big things like trees, I saw, bridges, all kinds of stuff. Characters, lots of scenes.
Dude, that's a huge problem too, because you have a character that's like relatively far from the wall.
Right.
And if you look at it from one angle, you see his screen space shadow with the VSMs as well. But then you occlude him from your camera view and you just see that shadow wipe off, and it doesn't look good.
Yeah. And it's like, this is the kind of thing where, again, in most games, I like their use of screen space shadows, but in this case, it's just a weird choice. It just seems like a weird choice that's very, probably very intent on preserving performance, but it feels like the wrong application of screen space shadows to me. But yeah, those are my only real complaints. There are some minor issues with like foliage snapping into an animated state. We saw that with Borderlands 4 and also with The Outer Worlds 2. That pops up in some places, but it's not as obnoxious, at least in the levels that I saw. Overall, I think this is a great looking current gen game. And if you go back to the first game, you really see those limitations of UE4. Those are brought into full exposure here by contrast with the second game. You get the glowing characters, you get lots of pop-in, you get lots of ugly looking screen space effects. Obviously, those are also in the second game, but probably to a lesser extent. And the shadows can be really low quality. In High on Life 2, I think you see a consistently higher quality presentation. Some of that probably comes down to higher budgeted art and just more resources to work with there. But probably a lot of it comes down to that much enhanced lighting presentation actually bringing out the fidelity in the artwork that was there, that is there in this game. So it's a satisfying look, and it kind of has a bit of a CG-like look at times. Not always, but certainly in these outdoor areas that are nicer lit, it can have a really pleasant looking appearance.
I agree, and I feel like they've successfully sort of captured the look that you can see that they wanted to achieve in the original, but were limited by the nature of Unreal Engine 4. This does genuinely pull it off, and since it's not going for photorealism, but instead that CGI-like appearance, I actually think it's more successful than some of the UE5 games we have seen have been. And it's genuinely very attractive, and because of Lumen, all the characters and environments feel sort of like properly integrated in a way, right? And some of the dramatic lighting and everything really works together to create some excellent results. So I'm very happy with what they've done there. The animation, of course, is good as well. And everything just looks super, super smooth. They've done that thing where a lot of objects, when you look closely at them, you can't really visibly see polygon meshes or edges. It just has that perfectly round CGI look to it, which is obviously the intent. So they've really succeeded on that front, and I think this game just it's awesome looking. And they got things right, like even though the weapons are very weird, like their positioning on the screen and the way they move and animate, I think is very satisfying in a way. And that's very, very important to a shooter like this. You want it to feel great, and it does. So it's a good looking game. I'm happy with most of their decisions, and I think you are as well. But of course, they're shipping this on many platforms, or at least multiple platforms. So for now, it's the PlayStation 5 systems, the Xbox systems, and PC. So that's like 4 different console platforms there, plus PC. You tested it on consoles. What did you find? Let's start with PlayStation 5.
Yeah, so I actually played the game predominantly on PS5 because that seems to be the platform that people are very interested in, and obviously the PS5 is kind of our starting point for a lot of these console titles here. So on PS5, I'd say that image quality isn't horrible when we look at the settings, but it isn't great either. It's a UE5 game and it's using TSR for AA and upscaling, and it's targeting 60 FPS, so something had to give. There's no quality mode in this title, it's just that 60 FPS targeting, basically equivalent of a performance mode in this case. And the shots I looked at came in at about 720p internally in typical play, with some DRS in the mix as well. I think possibly some DRS in the mix, or perhaps I'm just a little bit imprecise in my counts because there was some variance. The game also has a really curious option in the settings that's a render scale option, which at default is 75% and scales up to 200%. But I don't think this does anything in the current build because both 200% scale and 75% scale both counted to about 720p internally for me in the shots I tested. But it's possible there's a screen percentage that's being set, and then maybe it's being overridden by DRS or some other behavior, right? So it could just be functioning in some weird way here. I'm not quite sure. Maybe if you play this game on PS6, it will expose, the true range of resolutions that's open to this title. But in theory, 75% should be about 1/8 the pixels, I think, of a 200% scale. And obviously we're not seeing that delta here.
That's very strange, Oliver. Like the idea of including a render scale option in a console game, first of all, isn't something I've really seen. And second of all, it seems like it doesn't even work. So that almost feels like a mistake.
It could also be, I know there's a patch coming in for this game that I don't think we've tested yet. It could be this is removed in that patch, or it could be that it changes behavior in that patch. I don't know. I'm just reporting the behavior as I currently see it.
Sure.
And as I've currently tested it, there is no difference here. So regardless of what you set that slider to, which doesn't make any, kind of makes sense,
No.
doesn't really make sense. Anyways, little side detail. In performance terms, the game does target 60, but it can be quite unstable, particularly in larger fights, larger gameplay scenes. City areas will run in like the 40s and 50s pretty often. Smaller areas will hit 60 much more consistently. So it's still mostly 60 FPS, but it's pretty wobbly, and that's not ideal. And when it does drop, sometimes you can feel some larger stutters. So if you're like running around the city, I shouldn't say running, I should say skateboarding around the city, obviously, rail grinding around the city, you will hit some bigger stutters in the mix, not just like your 33 millisecond frames, but your 50 millisecond frames, your 67 millisecond frames, whatever. It'll hit some of those larger stutters in there as well. So that's a bit of a negative behavior that we'll observe in some of the larger gameplay spaces too.
One quick question though, Oliver, did you get a chance to test this with the PS5's VRR option?
I did test a little bit with VRR. I don't have VRR capture for you here, but basically it had the kind of frame rate drops that you're seeing on screen here. It felt a little bit smoother, but I would actually say that in a lot of instances, because the nature of the game's frame rate drops seemed more CPU bound, especially in wide open areas during traversal and things like that, it still felt pretty unstable, I would say. It still did not feel that great on PS5, even though notionally it should be, somewhat smoother.
Okay, that's interesting. So it sounds like PS5 is overall pretty okay. Not perfect, but good enough, shall we say, which is nice to see. What about PS5 Pro? Do we have any evidence of PSSR, for instance? Anything else that separates the Pro? And what about performance?
Well, there's very, very obvious evidence of PSSR, because if you go into the settings, there's a toggle between temporal super resolution and Sony PSSR. So there is a toggle for PSSR in this title. I tested both. They both seem to render at about 792p internally, although it's possible, again, DRS variants possibly in the mix there, possibly some sampling error there on my part. Possibly it's a little closer to PS5 than that number would indicate, but in any case, it's like a 720p class internal resolution, not much higher than PS5. But they trade off in some interesting ways, the TSR presentation and the PSSR presentation. So TSR tends to have like larger aliases on high contrast geometric edges, whereas PSSR has less of those, but more fundamental instability and noise, right? So if you look at the image, you're seeing that kind of salt and peppery pattern of noise everywhere and a little bit of softness in the image as well. In most of these exterior shots, there's not a huge difference. But when we look at more strongly indirectly lit scenes with a lot of, interesting diffuse GI contribution, scenes with a lot of reflections, PSSR has trouble resolving correctly the game's lighting, portraying it plausibly with the denoising. It tends to flicker and fizzle much more obviously. Here, Lumen is really designed around TSR. That's quite evident. I don't know how you chalk this one up, but it kind of seems pretty clear at this point that if you just put PSSR into a UE5 game, there's a good chance you're going to get worse results than the native TSR, and I think that's probably the case here, at least with respect to a lot of the game's lighting characteristics. I think it's just worse, so that's not very positive. Beyond that PSSR, TSR selection, it looks very similar to the base PS5, and performance is similar to the base PS5 as well. I think it's maybe a little bit smoother, still drops in some of the same places, bigger fights, city traversal, etc. But it's, it depends on how you see it. Like for a demanding UE5 title, targeting 60 FPS, some drops here and there, is it the end of the world? Probably not. But is it ideal? That's also not true, right? So it's
Sure.
a bit of variance there. Then rounding up the last two consoles really quickly, Xbox Series X. I didn't have as much time to test the Xboxes here, so I just wanted to go through them fairly quickly. Xbox Series X, it looks similar to PS5, maybe a slightly higher resolution. Possibly I was getting 792p counts in the mix there, but again, hard to say exactly what this game's resolution is pegged to internally. Performance feels a bit better than PS5. It's still kind of a wobbly 60, but in my limited play, it was a more consistent wobbly 60, so not ideal in any case. But okay. And then moving on to Series S, closing out our console platforms here. Series S could be a whole video of its own because it's just completely different from the other platforms. They've completely stripped back the way this game looks. So there's no Lumen, either Lumen diffuse RTGI or a specular or the reflection component of Lumen. So it has a super flat, very last gen look. This game has really been designed around RT lighting and around like neon and emissives and all this crazy stuff, all the neon on the sci-fi lighting. That's totally lost here. That sense is totally lost here. A lot of areas look totally dark, overly dark as a result, and just look incorrect. Like all over the place, the lighting just looks completely incorrect. Shadows are also downgraded and texture assets are lower res. So like walking around the environment, it's pretty evident that a lot of the assets are downgraded considerably here. As an upside though, internal resolutions are quite comparable to the other platforms, so it counted a bit below 720p in my shots.
Oh, goody.
It still targets, yeah, not too exciting maybe in the abstract, but relative to the other platforms, it's holding its own. And it does actually still target 60 FPS, and it mostly hits 60 FPS a lot of the time. It does drop during heavier segments. And I suspect the game is maybe a little bit more GPU bound here than on the other consoles, because of where it's dropping and how it's dropping and how view dependent that drop happens to be. That's kind of my sense of it, although I did not explore this too intimately here. But, you'd think that, again, if RAM limits aren't too much of an issue, maybe 30 FPS with those lighting features would have been a better option. But yeah, geez, I don't know. Not too good on Series S. But I know that, John, you covered a system that's completely the opposite from the Series S, I'm sure, which is the PC experience, specifically the experience on your relatively high-end PC system. So
Yes.
how did that come about? Did you actually get a good UE5 experience in the high-end Life 2 on PC? Because we know those can be hard to come by.
So yes, that's the thing, right, Oliver? So using a high-end PC first, that's what I have available. It's a good way to test just whether you can actually achieve a good playable experience or not right off the bat, right? If you can't do it on a high-end 5090 based system, then you're probably not going to be able to do it on anything. In this case, I will say this game is more demanding than I expected, but the experience is good, but with caveats. What I mean by that is, so some of this is something that supposedly will be improved with a patch, right? The stutter. So
Right.
there's two types of stutter in this game. There's the more traversal based stutter, which I think is what you're seeing on the console. And then there's also compilation stutter, perhaps. There is a pre-compilation process here. So when you boot up the game and hit new game or load game or whatever, you actually get a small process firing up in the lower left-hand corner. It shows this happening. That's good. And the stuttering is not too severe, but I definitely noticed instances where shooting enemies for the first time and doing certain actions for the first time would trigger that typical sort of blip in the frame time, which isn't great, but I didn't find it like horrendously horrible. I'm not as offended as Alex is by it, but it's definitely there. I found that when running, so it supports FSR 4, it says, as well as recent DLSS, in addition to 2 temporal upsampling options. I guess probably TSR and TAAU, perhaps. They're both in there. And there is frame generation, both the AMD variant and multi-frame gen from NVIDIA, which is good. The rest of the options, though, are extremely basic. It's just the typical, like, high, very high, whatever, UE5 stuff that you see for things like post-processing, textures, etc., right? So most of the performance when I found, based on my brief testing, it did seem to be somewhat resolution sensitive, as is often the case with UE5 games. So I opted to play with DLAA in frame generation on this system to hit a refresh cap of around 160 hertz, right? And that was largely good, but I did have some initial configuration issues with frame generation that resulted in some weird glitches. So I did have to fiddle around, make sure you cap the frame rate correctly. It didn't work well with forced VSync like I sometimes do, and that caused a lot of visual bugginess, which wasn't great. Without frame gen, however, using DLSS quality mode, I was able to hit around, in busy sections, it was around like 80 to 90 FPS.
Okay.
So, not bad. Playing an ultra wide 5120 by 2160 resolution, so pretty high res there, obviously with the percentage taken into account for DLSS quality. So I was also disappointed that HDR is not natively supported here, but you can force it using other methods. It's not
Mhm.
optimal, and perhaps there will be a proper mod to add it that looks excellent, like Reno DX or something like that. It's not there yet, obviously, pre-release. But still, even with these minor issues, being able to play in ultra wide at frame rates above 60 FPS with a much, much, much better image quality than the consoles, I do definitely still feel like this is probably the place to play if you have pretty high-end PC. But I didn't get a chance to test this on lower end hardware. I don't even, outside of the Steam Deck, I don't have much handy here anyways. And I curious to see if the Series S scalability is actually an option here on PC, because that might be necessary to make this playable on something like a Steam Deck. Did you happen to see, is this a verified game on the deck, or is this not?
Unfortunately, at the moment, John, just I don't think that it is Steam Deck verified. I think the original game is Steam Deck verified, but I don't
Makes
think
sense.
the sequel is Steam Deck verified as of yet, although that might change in the coming weeks and months after they maybe do some post-launch optimization. But yeah, I would be curious to see if those Series S settings do transfer over to Steam Deck or do transfer over to some of these lower power configurations. One platform that I would expect it to transfer over to pretty much one-to-one is the Switch 2, because there's a Switch
Yes.
2 version of this game coming in April. And actually, one of my primary interests with covering this port was to evaluate it for a Switch 2 video, possibly down the line, because I was expecting, if they ship all these high-end UE5 features in this game, and they're also going to ship it on Switch 2, couldn't that mean that we're going to see like high-end Lumen, Nanite, VSM, whatever on Switch 2? And instead, what we've seen with the Series S version is that they've stripped back the game quite considerably, to the point where a Switch 2 version, were it to make the same compromises, would not be nearly as notable or interesting from our perspective, unfortunately. Certainly wouldn't be nearly as good looking as we might expect. I think we're going to have to wait for, there have been some games that have been rumored. Expedition 33 is widely rumored for Switch 2. Perhaps that could make more of a dent in things, although its Series S version was cut back quite a bit as well. And I think Ark Survival Ascended, they were talking, I think, late last year or maybe in January of this year, about using 30 FPS with frame generation, so 15 frames per second internally, and using all of the UE5 features on their Switch 2
Oh,
version.
I bet that's going to be awesome. I'm sure it's going to run like butter and just look amazing. I can't wait.
Yeah. So that didn't sound too promising, but at least it does indicate they would not be skimping out on any visual features there, presumably, at least from what they've been indicating. For this game, at the moment on current generation consoles and PC, I think I'm pretty satisfied with it. I actually kind of like what this game represents, also what some other games represent, like Expedition 33 recently, which is that like on UE5, you can build a game that is maybe not quite cutting edge, but looks really attractive, has all these visual features that would be very prohibitive to build into a custom engine. And you can have a game that comes out that has like really high quality AAA graphics fidelity with a team of like not that many people. I did see this game's credit sequence because there's a way to fail the game and see the credit sequence early, and it does not seem to have, I don't know, more than 60 or 70 people who are working on it. And this game released just a little bit over 3 years after the last game, and less than 3 years after the last game's ports. So this is a pretty speedy production process for a game of this fidelity, at this caliber of production, for sure.
That's pretty awesome, actually.
Yeah. So that's actually a pretty welcome sign here. And I think at the moment, at least on current generation consoles, it's decent. It's okay. Could be better. For really demanding UE5 title, though, we would not necessarily expect it to hit 60 FPS in all circumstances. And we would not necessarily expect the best image quality in the world, but it does make you pine a little bit for like a PS6 or like a next generation Xbox or something to just clean up all these issues. But I think that's probably going to be a refrain that we hear quite a lot over the coming years.
And unfortunately, Oliver, I regret to tell you that probably wouldn't happen anyway, because you see what happens here, right? Each new console generation, push it just a bit further until we're back down into those resolution and
Yeah.
performance issue zone. That's just how it goes.
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, CrossGen could save us for a while, but then we'll be back to, I'm sure, much the same situation at some point, at least.
We're done, but there is one thing. I don't. Oh man, we can't. I don't want to spoil it. We could tell you, but I'm not going to spoil it here. There is an NES game in here that I literally almost fell out of my chair when I saw it. They put that in there. I don't even understand like what demented soul thought, yeah, let's put that in our game. Let's get this and put it in the game. They did it. It's so insane. Like, I don't know what to say. I don't even know if you have any familiarity with what this thing is, but my goodness.
No, I don't have a specific familiarity with the game that John is referencing, which I'm pointedly keeping off screen here. But there are a lot of really weird things. There are like jokes in this game about Silent Hill 2 and the Pyramid Head guy and all kinds of weird stuff going on and all kinds of insane game references. And obviously the NES game that you mentioned. And you play through this section where you're like fighting with an opponent who's navigating through the menu screens, so you have to like change the toggles to knock him off menu items and things like that. There's a lot of stuff going on in here that's like maybe not to everyone's taste, but it's certainly a fun and interesting change of pace from your normal, like very serious video game fare.
And fundamentally, that's why I think this game is really cool when we're checking out, because it is one of the, we cover a lot of games, Oliver. We play a lot of games, and there's a little bit of a sameness to things these days. Not necessarily in a bad way, but when you're looking in the larger game space, like you just kind of look at something, oh, okay, I know how this is going to play, or I know what to expect as this game continues.
Mm-hmm.
But this game, delightfully, is something that does things that you don't see coming. And I really, really appreciate that. When those land and you see the stuff that they're trying to do in there, you're like, okay, that's clever. You got me. And it happens a lot. So like just based on that alone, in addition to the awesome core mechanics and everything, I do think this game is well worth checking out. It puts a smile on my face. Even Oliver was smiling, which, that's I love to see it. But that's going to do it for this video, so I'm glad we could talk about it. And thanks for being here, Oliver, with all the details on those console versions.
Likewise, Sean, it was a pleasure as always.
And thank you, the audience, for watching, making it all the way to the end. And we'll see you next time.
Don't forget to check out the special discount link for CyberGhost VPN in the description below. For just $2.03 a month, you can get encrypted online security across a range of operating systems and devices. And with a 45-day money-back guarantee, it's risk-free too, so check it out today.